Welcome to the first day of the Brynn Sewalong. Today will be our biggest day of the sew-along, and we are going to be tackling the sleeves, the sleeve bands, and the side seams. I'm going to be sewing up 3 versions of the Brynn during the sew-along. I'm going to be doing all 3 of the different sleeve views, so be aware that you're going to see me jumping between all 3 of these fabrics as I sew up during the sew-along. Now, before you start, make sure that you've transferred all of the notches from your pattern pieces to your fabrics. I usually just make a little clip with my scissors into the notches. Just keep in mind that that seam allowance is only 3/8 of an inch, so make sure that your clips are shorter than that. Now, this very first step is actually only for the dress lengths of the Brynn cardigan, and I am not sewing up a dress length, so I don't actually have a visual of this, but essentially you are going to sew up the center back seam that is only on the dress view of the Brynn. So with right sides together, you're going to pin those center back seams together, and you're going to stitch them using a stretch stitch or a serger and a regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you're going to press those seam allowances either open or to one side. So now that our back is just one full back, whether you're doing the dress view or the top views, we're going to attach the fronts to the back at the shoulder seams. So with right sides touching, pin the front sections to the back at those shoulder seams, matching the notches. And then we'll go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch those shoulder seams together using either a stretch stitch, or you can also serge them. Now, since this is the first time that we are using our sewing machine, let's go ahead and get it set up. I'm going to be switching out my needle for a fresh needle. Make sure you're using either a stretch or a ballpoint needle that is specific for knit fabrics. It's also a good time to go ahead and practice the stretch stitch on your machine just to make sure that it's working well with your specific fabric. So you might have a stretch stitch that's already a specified stitch on your machine. It will look like a little lightning bolt. Or you can use the zigzag stitch on your machine and start with around a 2.5 millimeter length and a 0.5 millimeter width, and just kind of practice it on your fabric and see how it goes. Sometimes I like to lengthen the stitch a little bit more, especially when I'm top stitching, but once again, just practice on your own fabric and see what you like best. And then once you are happy with your stitch settings, go ahead and sew those shoulder seams together using, once again, either a stretch stitch like I'm doing for really all of the construction during the sew along, but you can also, of course, use your serger for this. And then go ahead and press those seam allowances open if you used your regular sewing machine like I did, or if you serged it, go ahead and press those seam allowances toward the back of your cardigan. Now, this is completely optional, but if you have a fabric like this striped one that I have here that is just a little on the stretchier side, or just doesn't have kind of the bounce back or stability as some of the other knits that you might use, you might want to add a little strip of this clear elastic to your shoulder seams. This is just going to keep it from growing over time, whether on your body or while it's hanging on a hanger. Once again, this is completely optional. But if you choose to do it, you are going to cut a piece of clear elastic that is the width of your shoulder seam, and you're going to go ahead and pin it so that the center of that clear elastic is centered over the stitch line that you're going to make. It can be a little tricky to get this all lined up, but just take your time and put lots and lots of pins in there. And then what we'll do is we'll go over to our sewing machine and we will stitch or serge right along that shoulder seam, catching the clear elastic in your line of stitching as you stitch. Okay, and this is what it would look like if you added that clear elastic. You can see it just gives it a little bit extra structure. You're going to go ahead and press the seam allowances. Just be extra careful that you don't melt that elastic when you do so. And let's move on to the next step. Okay, and this is what it would look like if you added that clear elastic. You can see it just gives it a little bit extra structure. You're going to go ahead and press the seam allowances. Just be extra careful that you don't melt that elastic when you do so. And let's move on to the next step. Now these next few steps are only for views B and C, which are the sleeved versions, and the steps are the same. I'm showing the long sleeve, but it's the same for the short sleeve. If you are sewing up view A, the sleeveless version, just fast forward just a little bit and we will get to finishing up that sleeve in just a bit. So you are going to take a sleeve and you're going to pin it with right sides touching to the coordinating armhole edge of the garment. Make sure that you are matching that middle notch to the shoulder seam, and then also of course match the front and back notches. Then we'll go over to our sewing machine or our serger and we will stitch that in a normal 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And once you have sewn on both of the sleeves, you're going to go over to your ironing board and you're going to press those seam allowances away from the body of the Brynn and towards the sleeve. Okay, continuing here with just the sleeved versions of the Brynn, we are going to pin the front to the back, right sides touching along the sides. Now we're going to pin both the side seam area as well as the underarm of the sleeve, and make sure that, you know, all of those, the lower edges align, that the hem of the sleeve aligns, and that also that underarm seam aligns on both sides. And then we're going to stitch that entire seam in one line of stitching from the hem all the way around through the sleeve to the hem of the sleeve. Now I'm doing this once again with a stretch stitch on my regular sewing machine, but you can also do this, of course, on your serger if you prefer. Now go ahead and press those seam allowances either open if you stitch it like I did, or towards the back if you serged it. Now the last thing that we need to do for the sleeved views, so views B and C, is we need to hem that sleeve. Now I'm going to use this soft stretch. I've talked about this lots on both Instagram and with my other patterns, but this is just a nice little bit of fusible hem tape. It is stretchy, but it just adds a little bit of stability to the hem, so you don't get that problem of like a wavy hem that kind of stretches out as you sew. You don't need to use this. This is completely optional, but I'm going to show you how I do it. So essentially you are going to fuse the soft stretch knit tape just to the very bottom area of the hem. It is 5/8 of an inch tall. So just using my iron, I'm going to go ahead and press and kind of just fuse the sticky side. Now there is a paper backing, and that's why I can put my iron straight on it. But then you pull off that paper backing, and then you can just go ahead and fold it up just on the edge of that tape, because it's 5/8 of an inch, which is what this pattern requires. And then you give it another press, and that's going to fuse that little area together, so you don't need to use any pins. And then you can just go ahead and stitch over it just like you normally would if you had pinned it in place. Now if you don't have the Heat and Bond soft stretch, that's totally fine too. You can just go ahead and fold up the bottom edge of that hem by 5/8 of an inch, pin it, and then just like normal we'll go over to our sewing machine and we will stitch that just close to that edge, so at about 1/2 inch from the bottom folded edge. Now, if you're doing views B or C, you're actually done for today. So what we're going to do now is we are going to tackle the armbands and the side seam for the sleeveless version. So for view A, the sleeveless view, we are going to line up the side seams, making sure that those top and bottom edges align, and with right sides touching, we're going to pin it together along both of the side seams. And then going over to either our sewing machine or our serger, we will stitch that in a stretch stitch at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then either press those seam allowances open if you stitched it like I did, or if you serged it, you can just press those seam allowances toward the back. Now go ahead and grab your armbands, and with right sides touching, you're going to pin the short ends of each armband together. Now I'm going to actually use the flat or the back side as the right side, just because I want the contrast of the armbands and the neckbands to be a little bit different than my main cardigan. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at it. If you feel like it looks like I'm actually pinning wrong sides together, I'm just doing it the opposite for my armbands and for my neckband. And then once those are pinned, you can go over to your sewing machine and either using a stretch stitch or by serging, you're going to sew those short ends together at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then you're going to press those seam allowances open if you stitched, or toward one side if you serged it. And then with wrong sides touching, you're going to fold each of the armbands in half lengthwise and give them a really good press. I used a lot of steam on my iron for this just to make sure that it really gets a nice crease and press that's going to stay. Okay, and now we are going to attach those armbands to the armhole opening. So with right sides touching, we're going to pin the folded armband to its coordinating armhole edge. Keep those raw edges even, and you're also going to just make sure that you're matching the front and back armhole notches to each other. Match the side seam to the armhole seam at the bottom, and then that middle notch on the armband is going to match up with the top shoulder seam. You're going to need to stretch the armband to fit between the notches and the seams, and this is because the armband is intentionally smaller than the armhole opening. This is to help it lay nice and flat, so just make sure that you add as many additional pins as necessary so that it is just evenly distributed around the armhole opening. And then we're going to go over to our sewing machine or our serger, and we are going to sew that armhole seam with either a stretch stitch or serging it. Now while you're sewing, you need to be slightly stretching the armband to fit. Be careful though that you're not stretching the armhole as you sew. Just wanted to add a little tip here. Stretch and recovery can really vary quite a bit with knit fabrics, even if they happen to have the same amount of stretch percentage. So if you are really looking to get the perfect fit, we do recommend basting this seam first, and then you can adjust that armband size if you need to. This is of course optional, but we do recommend doing this at least the first time you sew up this pattern. Okay, it should look something like this. Now we're going to go ahead and press these. You're going to press the armbands away from the garment, but the seam allowances will be pressed towards the garment. Okay, now you can be finished now, but we do have one more optional step. So once this is all pressed into place, if you want, you can do a row of edge stitching around the armhole. So this would be 1/16 of an inch inside of the garment, catching those seam allowances underneath. And this will just kind of let everything stay a little crisper and to help those seam allowances stay in place. I honestly kind of do this pretty rarely, but I want to go ahead and show you what it would look like. So I'm going to go ahead and do it on this view of the Brynn. Okay, and this is what it would look like if you go ahead and do that line of edge stitching. So you can see it looks pretty great there, and it does keep everything really nice in place and looking pretty sharp. So I'm going to give this a little steam and a press, and we are done for today. If you come back tomorrow, we are going to jump right in with the hem, and then we will sew on the neckband.